Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 235, Secret Missions. Last week, we talked Phil Sheridan. Little Phil is an interesting story, as he is a candidate to the pillars that hold up the Union victory, along with Grant. Who else is deserving of the spots on those pillars? It's kind of open to interpretation. Obviously, you have Sherman. You have a couple other candidates. Sheridan probably should be on the short list of individuals who might fill that slot. Hopefully, though, we have a better analysis of his career, shedding some more light on this particular figure. This week, we will shift back to some secret missions. I have two separate accounts of spying in the American Civil War. Before we do that, though, let's talk about our Patreon content. And obviously, we did a movie review. We did The Outlaw Josie Wales here. And we will be doing some more movie reviews. There's actually a couple that we've missed here. So we have some more on the schedule. But coming up here next month, we're actually going to be doing something a little bit different. We're going to be talking about roles in the Civil War and actually creating a point system for a score in terms of what role you would like to be in the war. It sounds a little bit different, and that's because it is. And if that sounds like it would be something that would interest you, we have done similar type episodes that are a little bit different. We've done other movie reviews, memoir reviews, picture slideshows of modern day battlefields. If any of that sounds like it would interest you, there is a link in the show description. Those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. They are greatly appreciated. So for this particular episode, on this week, I have actually picked two excerpts that I would like to read, and they are both about individuals that we've already talked about, and they're individuals that I've selected because I think they are interesting for two different reasons, and you'll kind of see why. The first is actually going to be Allan Pinkerton. Now, the Pinkertons, of course, we talked about them actually very early on in our story, all the way back in 1861, and this is actually where the storyline of this is going to be focused around. It's going to be the start of the Pinkertons and following some rebel spies. Remember, the Pinkertons are going to kind of pop into our story in terms of Lincoln and his travels to Washington. They're going to kind of be involved in that uncovering of the plot to assassinate him en route, and then they're going to continue in our story early on. They're going to be used by McClellan to gather intelligence. They're not going to be quite so good at the gathering of military intelligence. They're actually going to be feeding into McClellan's kind of exaggerations of troop strength. So they're not going to be good for that purpose. It takes a little bit of time for there to be a good military intelligence outlet that is developed in the BMI that is created. That's not till 1863 that really gets going. So 1862, the Pinkerton is not necessarily going to be the best individual for that job. But I think still the Pinkertons are an interesting kind of piece of the puzzle, and it kind of plays into the Civil War nicely here, especially in the early part. Now, the second is Belle Boyd, and we talked about Belle Boyd in our narrative episodes. We did a segment on Belle Boyd, and the reason why I selected this excerpt, I thought maybe it was worth revisiting, and this is from, obviously we have one from the northern perspective in the Pinkertons, and then we have one from the southern perspective in Belle Boyd, and there's a lot of interesting pieces, and I think you sometimes get that from individuals who were in this kind of area of the war in terms of spying, and there's a lot of fanciful stories, and you got that if you are a Patreon subscriber. We talked about Judson Knight and how he had this series of stories that he wrote, and he had a lot of kind of setting the story straight, really, if we get down to it, where he's like, oh, that didn't really happen, and this person is kind of setting a tall tale, and this person wasn't even there, right? And he has a lot of that he gets into, and it is an interesting look, and it's very fanciful that you can be like, I'm behind enemy lines and I have 2 pistols, and that kind of thing, and Bell Boyd also has this kind of air about some of these stories that is very much kind of fantastic, and like, does some of this stuff really happen? So I did want to also read some of that excerpt as well to kind of throw that out there, and we kind of mentioned that in the narrative, so I thought maybe it would be worthwhile to also visit that as well. But we'll go ahead and start here with Pinkerton. My department was in its infancy when I secured a house in Washington and gathered around me a number of resolute, trustworthy men and discreet women. I had not been many days in the city when one afternoon I was called upon by the Honorable Thomas A. Scott of Pennsylvania, who was then acting as the Assistant Secretary of War, who desired my services in watching a lady whose movements had excited suspicion. The residence of Mrs. Greenhow was situated at the corner of 13th and I Streets, quite a fashionable quarter of the city, and within a short distance of the White House. It was a 2-story and basement brick building, the parlors of which were elevated several feet above the ground. Entrance was obtained by ascending a flight of steps in the center of the edifice. This lady was a widow, her husband having died some years before, and being possessed of considerable means, and mingling with the highest circles of Washington society. Her home was the resort of most of the prominent people of the city. The instructions of the Secretary of War were that a strict watch should be kept upon this house, and that every person entering or leaving the same should become under close surveillance of my men, who should endeavor to ascertain who they were, and if they attempted, in any manner, to communicate with any suspicious persons. I was to report to him daily, and to continue my espionage until I received definite and official orders for its discontinuance. I took with me 2 of my men, and proceeded to the vicinity of the residence of Mrs. Greenhow. I was then quite a stranger in Washington, and localities were not as familiar to me as they are afterward, and I therefore preferred to reconnoiter by daylight to depending upon a survey after nightfall. The entire day had been dark, gloomy, and threatening. Clouds had been gathering in the heavens, and everything indicated the imminence of a severe storm. As I left my headquarters, a slight shower of rain was falling, which I knew was but the precursor of a storm more violent. On arriving at the designated locality, I found everything to be as they already had been described to me. The inside shutters to the windows were closed, and no sign was apparent to the house was occupied. And after carefully noting the situation and the exposed condition of the premise, I left the 2 men within a convenient distance of the place, and returned for the additional aid which I thought might be needed. Selecting 3 of my most discreet men, I again repaired to the scene of operations. We had not proceeded far when the storm burst upon us in all its fury. The wind blew strong and chill, and the rain fell in deluging torrents. Umbrellas were a useless commodity, and unprotected, we were compelled to breast the elements, which now were whirring with terrible violence. Arriving at Mrs. Greenhouse under the cover of darkness, I posted my men in such positions as I thought would be most advantageous for our purpose, and then calling in 2 whom I had left there during the afternoon, I approached to within a short distance of the house. The darkness and storm, which decidedly uncomfortable, were of some benefit to us, as but few people were abroad, and these paid no attention to passing events, seeming to be only too anxious to reach their destination and to escape the pitiless rain. The blinds at the windows were still closed, but a light was observed in 2 rooms upon the parlor floor, and I knew that the house was occupied. Of course, I could see nothing within, and my view was entirely obstructed by the closed blinds, and at length becoming impatient at this unprofitable and unsatisfactory waiting, I determined to obtain a glimpse at least of the interior, and to ascertain if possible some knowledge of its occupants. The parlor windows through which the lights were gleaming were too high from the ground to permit me to see within, and summoning the 2 men which were waiting instructions, I made use of their strong, broad shoulders. Ranging the 2 men side by side under the broad windows in front of the house, I removed my boots, and, upon their shoulders, and elevated sufficiently high to enable me to accomplish the objective I had in view. I was now on level with the windows, and noiselessly raising the sash and turning the slats of the blinds, I obtained a full view of the interior of the room, but to my disappointment, it was unoccupied. I was about to give expression to my chagrin at this discovery when a warning from one of the study reporters induced me to be silent. Someone was approaching the house, and hastily clambering down from my perch, we hid ourselves under the stoop, which led up the front door. Scarcely had we ensconced ourselves in this convenient shelter when we heard the footsteps of the newcomer, and to our satisfaction he stopped in front of the house, ascending the steps, rang the bell, and in a short time he was admitted. By this time we were drenched to the skin. The rain had fallen in copious showers, and during all the time we had been exposed to its dampening influences. But paying but little heed to this, we again took our position in front of the windows, and I was soon remounted upon the shoulders of my operatives, prepared to take notes of what transpired. First, a couple of notes here I guess we can point out here. At the very beginning, he actually points out that he does hire not only men but women as well, as a kind of a groundbreaking thing in that he does have agents, and there's very famously in the Lincoln case, there are women agents that he has hired that are providing him information. So that is actually very interesting that he does point out here, even in this particular account, which is a little bit later, of course, than the Lincoln case. But I also want to point out, it obviously seems to be very, very nice to be the boss, in that you are constantly using these guys as human ladders. He seems to definitely be using that position to his advantage for sure. As the visitor entered the parlor and seated himself, awaiting the appearance of the lady of the house, I immediately recognized him as an officer of the regular army, who I had met that day for the first time. He was a captain of infantry, and was in command of one of the stations of the provost marshal. I will call him Captain Ellison. He was a tall, handsome man of a commanding figure, and about 40 years of age. He had removed his cloak, and as he sat there in blue uniform, in full glare of the gaslight, he looked a veritable, ideal soldier. As I watched him closely, however, I noticed that there was a troubled, restless look upon his face. He appeared ill at ease, and shifted nervously upon his chair, as though impatient for the interest of his hostess. In a few moments, Mrs. Greenhow entered and cordially greeted her visitor, who acknowledged her salutations with a courtly bow, while his face lighted up with pleasure as he gazed upon her. Just at this moment, I again received a warning from my supporters, and hastily jumped to the ground. We hid ourselves until the pedestrians had passed out of sight and hearing. When I assumed my station, the captain and Mrs. Greenhow were seated at the table at the rear part of the room, and their conversation was carried on such in low tones that, in consequence of the storm that was still raging, I could not catch but fragmentary sentences. At last, however, accustoming myself to the noise, I heard enough to convince me that this trusted officer was then and there engaged in betraying his country, and furnishing to his treasonably inclined companion such information regarding the disposition of our troops as he possessed. Presently he took from an inner pocket of his coat a map, which he held up before the light. I imagined I could identify a plan of the fortifications in and around Washington, and which also designated a contemplated plan of attack. So just as a note, this is after First Manassas. This is 1861 after that. And obviously, as you recall, and as I've mentioned in the narratives as well, the disaster that was First Manassas for the Lincoln administration is compounded by the fact that Washington is so close to where it happened, right? You have Joseph E. Johnston's army that was combined with that of Beauregard's. They're essentially right there at the doorstep of the Capitol. And the one thing that Lincoln is constantly terrified of is that if Washington falls into the hands of the Confederates, then that gives these rebels legitimacy in the eyes of a foreign power. And that is something that simply just cannot happen. And that's why there is just a massive amount of fortifications that pop up all around Washington. And hopefully I can post a map at some point in the future. And I think maybe actually in a past episode, I think I did post a map, but it is like a ridiculous amount of fortifications and definitely overkill, right? If you see a map of the fortifications around Richmond, you're kind of like, this kind of seems like the normal amount of fortifications around a capital city. And, you know, especially if you put into consideration that Richmond was considered to be abandoned at one point, you probably like, this makes sense. And the main siege for Richmond, the contestment for Richmond, you could even say was at Petersburg, and that's probably where more fortifications were anyway. They're 64 into 65, But then you have Washington with all these forts that are stringed around the city. And, it's kind of like there's all this emphasis at 1861, and then 62 you have Stonewall, and that's why McDowell is going to stay where he is, and there's constantly this emphasis on these troops need to be kind of within striking distance so they can get back to Washington if they need to. And you have these heavy artillery units, right, who are going to stay in the defenses, and Grant's finally going to be able to pry those out of the defenses so that he can use those as combat troops. And it's a close run thing that the 6th Corps has to get all the way back there to defend against Jubal Early. And, with Jubal Early, I've been able to actually capture Washington and hold it. Probably not hold it, but, he might have been able to do some damage. And like I said, it's a close run thing that the 6th Corps actually gets back there. And that kind of also goes to show that Lincoln has a lot more trust in Grant than he has in anyone else, and that he's able to kind of relinquish this sort of claim on Washington, and how there needs to be an emphasis on Washington. They certainly would not have had that kind of trust, that kind of belief in the plan that McClellan would have, or really any other general officer, at least in my mind, that, it's okay, you don't have to have these troops. And Grant is so reluctant to even send the 6th Corps back. He's like, I kind of need these guys in terms of my operations. And he's like, fine. And he finally sends them back. And again, they get there just in time to stop. And, you also have, ironically, you have Lew Wallace, a guy that Grant kind of blames for Shiloh ending up the way it is. He, obviously he's kind of ticked off at Lew Wallace for sort of getting lost at Shiloh. And ironically, he's the one that actually stops the army just enough to actually allow for the 6th Corps to arrive. But again, I digress. The point is that, at least at this point in time, when their story is that regardless of how feasible it really is for the Confederate Army to take the city, in terms of the War Department, the Lincoln administration, in terms of the Secretary of War, this is very much a huge threat, very much an emphasis if there is any kind of information that's going to be leaked out in terms of how to get by these defenses and take the city. After watching their movements for some time, during which they would frequently refer to the map before them, as though pointing out particular points or positions, I was again compelled to hide myself under the shelter of the convenient stoop, and when I resumed my position, the room was empty. The delectable couple had disappeared. I waited impatiently for more than an hour, taking occasional glimpses into the room, and watching for their reappearance. At the end of that time, they re-entered the parlor, arm in arm, and again took their seats. Again came their warning voice, and again I hastily descended. And as the retreating figures disappeared in the distance, I could hear the front door open, and the step of the traitor captain above me. With a whispered good night, and something that sounded very much like a kiss, he descended the steps, and then without paying attention to the fact that I was without shoes, I started in pursuit of him, and through the blinding mist and pelting storms, kept him in view as he rapidly walked away. It was then about 12:30, and the storm evinced no sign of discontinuance. I was not sufficiently acquainted with the city at the time to tell in what direction he was going, but I determined to ascertain his destination before I left him. I was compelled to keep pretty close to him, owing to the darkness of the night, and several times I was afraid that he would hear the footsteps of a man who accompanied mine. I was confident he would not be detected, as I was drenched in stockings. I crept along as stealthily as a cat. Well, there's another, obviously he's not going to hear me because I'm pretty stealthy. I'm a stealthy spy, but this other guy that was with me, maybe he would have heard me, right? Twice I imagined that he would turn around as though suspecting he was followed, but as he did not stop, I reassured myself and plodded on. I could not, however, disabuse my mind for fear that I had been seen. I could not relax my vigilance. I resolved to take my chances of discovery. I knew who my man was, and at all events, and now I must ascertain where he was going. He passed a guard on duty and quickly passed into a building immediately in advance of me. This movement was so unexpected that I had no time to turn back. I was so close to him that it would have been very unwise to have done so. But I was more surprised when, as I reached the building into which the captain disappeared, I was suddenly confronted by 4 armed soldiers who rushed suddenly out upon me with fixed bayonets, pointing at my breast. Realizing that an attempt at resistance or escape be both foolish and useless, I attempted to make an explanation, all to no purpose, however. I informed them that I had been out late and lost my way, but they refused to listen and ordered my companion and myself to march at once to the guardhouse. About 8 days after this, orders were given for the arrest of Mrs. Greenhow herself. She was confined in her own house, and all her papers were seized and handed to the custody of the Department of War. The intention of the government was to treat her as humanely and considerately as possible, but withstanding all offers of kindness or courtesy, the lady was discovered on several occasions attempting to send messages to her rebel friends, and finally her removal to the old Capitol prison was ordered, and she was conveyed there, where she was imprisoned for several months. After this, she was conveyed across lines and reached in safety the rebel capital, where she was greeted by the more congenial spirits of rebeldom. Mrs. Greenhow afterwards went to Europe in some trustworthy capacity for the Confederacy, and while there she was known for her bitter animosity to the Union. So we actually know from our narrative episodes that Rose O'Neal Greenhow was a pretty well-known Confederate spy and participates in the early stages of the war for the Confederacy in terms of giving them information that's actually quite useful for the first Manassas campaign. But it's actually an interesting take on here on Pinkerton and describing this operation. I think it is a worthwhile kind of look into the thought process of having these agents and really the surveillance of it all. And we can kind of connect that with a kind of a modern day spy thriller, right? We can see sort of the connection there, but there's also sort of like, you can tell how it's kind of not quite the James Bond-ness of it, where he doesn't have shoes and he's chasing after this guy, and then he ends up getting actually put in the guardhouse by his own guys, right? By Union soldiers. So you kind of, the green nature of this spy network is also on full display, and the Pinkertons are probably not, military spies, right? I mean, we mentioned that kind of at the top of the episode. So there's also that to be pointed out here with this tale. So an interesting kind of look at both of those sides of the coin. So similarly to Pinkerton, we also have Bell Boyd, and Pinkerton wrote that account himself. Bell Boyd writes this account herself, so we have kind of this comparison, and that's why I kind of paired these two together as well, in that not only do we have one from North and South, as I mentioned, but we also have kind of these first-hand accounts, and again, probably sprinkled in there a little bit of, I kind of poked a little fun at Pinkerton here in the first one, a little bit of maybe a little flair, shall we say, and you can't really blame an individual maybe for putting their own little touch in there, probably. On the evening of May 23rd, 1862, I was sitting in the window of the room, reading my grandmother and cousin, when one of the servants rushed in and shouted, or rather shrieked, "Oh, Miss Bell, I think the rebels are coming, for the Yankees are making awful fuss in the street." I immediately sprang from my seat and went to the door. I then found that the servant's report was true. The streets were thronged with Yankee soldiers, running about every direction and in great confusion. I asked the federal officer what was the matter. He answered the Confederates were approaching the town in force under Generals Jackson and Ewell, and they had surprised and captured the outside picket, and actually advanced within a mile of the town, without the attack being even suspected. Now, he added, we are endeavoring to get the ordnance and quartermaster stores out of their reach. What will you do, I asked, with the stores in the large depot? Burn them, of course. But suppose the rebels came upon you too quickly. Then we will fight as long as we can, by any possibility show a front, and the event of defeat make good our retreat upon Winchester, burning the bridges as soon as we cross them, and finally effect a junction with General Banks' force. I parted with the federal officer, and returned to the home. I began to walk quietly upstairs, when suddenly I heard the report of a rifle, and almost at the same moment I encountered Mr. Clark, who was in his rapid descent from his room, very nearly knocked me down. Great heavens, what's the matter? Nothing to speak of, said I. Only the rebels are coming, and you had best prepare yourself for a visit to Liberty Prison. He answered not a word, but rushed back to his room, and commenced compressing to as small a compass as possible all the manuscripts upon which so much plumed himself, and upon which he derived the fame and credit for the illustrious journal to which he was the contributor. It was his intention to collect and secure these inestimable treasures, and then skedaddle. I immediately went for my opera glasses, and on my way to the balcony in front of the house, from which position I intended to reconnoiter. I was obliged to pass Mr. Clark's door. It was open, but the key was on the outside. The temptation of making him a Yankee prisoner was too strong to be resisted, and yielded to the impulse. I quietly locked in the special correspondent of the New York Herald. After this feat, I hurried to the balcony, and by the aid of my glasses described the advance guard of the Confederates. at the distance of about 3/4 of a mile, marching rapidly upon the town. To add to my anxiety, my father, who was at the time upon General Garnett's staff, was with them. My heart beat alternately with hope and fear. I was not ignorant of the trap the Yankees had set for my friends. I was in possession of much important information, which I could only contrive to convey to General Jackson. I knew our victory would be secure. Without it, I had every reason to anticipate defeat and disaster. The intelligence I was in possession of instructed me that General Banks was in Strasburg with 4,000 men, that the small force at Winchester could be readily reinforced by General White, who was at Harper's Ferry, and that Generals Shields and Geary were a short distance below Front Royal, while Fremont was beyond the valley further, and this was the vital point. They had been decided all three separate divisions should cooperate against General Jackson. I again went down to the door, and this time I observed standing about in groups several men who had always professed attachment to the cause of the South. I demanded if there was one amongst them who would venture to carry to General Jackson the information I possessed. They all in one accord said, "No, you go." I did not stop to reflect. My heart, though beating fast, was not appalled. I put on a white sunbonnet and started at a run down the street, which was thronged with Federal officers and men. I soon cleared the town and gained the open fields, which I traversed with unabated speed, hoping to escape observation until such a time I could make my way to the Confederate line, which was still rapidly advancing. I had on a dark blue dress with a little fancy white apron over it, and this contrast of colors being visible at a great distance made me far more conspicuous than was just then agreeable. The skirmishing between the outposts was sharp. The main forces of the opposing armies were disposed as follows. The Federals had placed their artillery on lofty eminence, which commanded the road by which the Confederates were advancing. The Confederates were in line directly in front of the hospital, into which their artillerymen were throwing shells with deadly precision, for the Yankees had taken this as a shelter and were firing upon the Confederate troops from the window. At this moment, the Federal pickets, who were rapidly falling back, perceived me still running as fast as I was able, and immediately fired upon me. My escape was most providential, for, although I was not hit, the rifle bullets flew thick and fast about me, and more than one struck the ground so near my feet, so as to throw dust. Nor was this all. The Federals in the hospital, seeing in what direction the shots of their pickets were aimed, followed the example, and also opened fire upon me. Upon this occasion my life was spared, by what means to me then, and seemed still a little short of a miracle, for besides the numerous bullets but whistled in my ears, several actually pierced different parts of my clothing, but not one reached my body. Besides all this, I was exposed to a crossfire from the Federal and Confederate artillery, whose shot and shell flew whistling and hissing over my head. At length the Federal shell struck the ground within 20 yards of my feet. The explosion, of course, sent the fragments flying in every direction around me. I had, however, just time to throw myself flat upon the ground before the deadly engine burst, and again Providence spared my life. Springing upon the danger was past, I pursued my career, still under a heavy fire. I shall never run again as I ran on that day. Hope, fear, the love of life, and the determination to serve my country to the last conspired to fill my heart with more than feminine courage, and to lend preternatural strength and swiftness to my limbs. I often marvel, and even shudder, when I reflect how I cleared the fields and bounded over the fences with the agility of a deer. As I neared the lines, I waved my bonnet to our soldiers, to intimate to them to press forward, upon which one regiment, the 1st Maryland Rebel Infantry, and Hayes's Louisiana Brigade gave me a loud cheer, and without waiting for further orders, dashed upon the town at a rapid pace. They did not know who I was then, and they were naturally surprised to see a woman on the battlefield, and on the spot too, where the fire was so hot. Their shouts of approbation and triumph rang in my ears for many a day afterwards, and I still hear them not unfrequently in my dreams. At this juncture, the main body of the Confederates was hidden from view by a slight elevation which intervened between me and them. My heart almost ceased to beat with me, for a dreadful thought rose in my mind, that our force must be too weak and any match for the Federals, and that the gallant men who had just been applauding me were rushing upon a certain and fruitless death. I accused myself of having urged them to their fate, and now, quite overcome by fatigue and by the feelings which tormented me, I sank upon my knees and offered a short but earnest prayer to God. Then I felt as if supplication was answered, and that I was inspired with fresh spirits and a new life. Not only despair, but fear also forsook me, and I had again no thought but how to fulfill the mission I had already pursued so far. I rose from the kneeling posture, and I had proceeded but a short distance, when to my unspeakable, indescribable joy, I caught sight of a main body fast approaching, and soon an old friend and connection of mine, Major Harry Douglas, rode up, and recognizing me, cried out, while he seized my hand, "Good God, Belle, you here? What is it?" "Oh, Harry," I gasped. "Give me time to recover my breath." For some seconds I could say no more, but as soon as I had sufficiently recovered myself, I told him all, urging him to hurry on the cavalry, with orders him to see the bridges before the retreating Federals could have time to destroy them. He instantly galloped off to report to General Jackson, who immediately rode forward and asked me if I would have an escort and a horse wherewith to return to the village. I thanked him and said no, I would go as I came, and then acting upon the information I was spared to convey, the Confederates gained a most complete victory. Though the depot building had been fired and was burning, our cavalry reached the bridges barely in time to save them from destruction. The retreating Federals had just crossed, and were actually upon the point of lighting the slow match, which, communicating the bursting charge, would have riven the arches into pieces. So hasty was their retreat that they left all their killed and wounded in our hands. Now, she's actually describing the Battle of Front Royal. If you recall, actually, there is an instance where bridges do need to be secured by Confederate cavalry during that battle, and Front Royal does then lead to Winchester as part of this string of action in the valley that Jackson is able to string together. Now, she mentions Harry Douglas, and interestingly enough, right, she's meaning Henry Kidd Douglas. And if you already have somebody who is exaggerating a lot, and you have Henry Kidd Douglas who exaggerates a lot, you kind of are running into two individuals. But fortunately enough, I do actually have, and I think this is actually pretty interesting, and one of the reasons why I wanted to read this account is that I do actually have I Rode with Stonewall, which is Henry Kidd Douglas's experience of the war. And this is what he has to say about Front Royal. And this is a paragraph from his account. "I observed almost immediately the figure of a woman in white glide swiftly out of town to our right, and after making a little circuit, run rapidly upon a ravine in our direction, and then disappear from sight. She seemed, when I saw her, to heed neither weeds nor fences, but waved a bonnet as she came, trying, it was evident, to keep the hill between herself and the village. I called General Jackson's attention to the singular movement just as a dip in the land hit her, and at General Yule's suggestion, he sent me to meet her and ascertain what she wanted. That was just to my taste, and it took only a few minutes for my horse to carry me to meet the romantic maiden, whose tall, supple, and graceful figure struck me as soon as I came in sight of her. As I drew near, her speed slackened, and I was startled momentarily at hearing her call my name. But I was not much astonished when I saw that the visitor was the well-known Belle Boyd, whom I had known from the earliest girlhood. She was just the girl to dare to do such things. Nearly exhausted, and with her hand pressed against her heart, she said in gasps, 'I knew it must be Stonewall when I heard the first gun. Go back quick and tell him that the Yankees' force is very small, 1 regiment of Maryland infantry, several pieces of artillery, and several companies of cavalry. Tell him I know, for I went through the camps and got a vow of an officer. Tell him to charge right down the hill and catch them all. I must hurry back. Goodbye now. My love to all the dear boys, and remember you meet me in town. You haven't seen me today.' Her eyes made cap. She kissed her hand and was gone. I delivered her message speedily, and while Jackson was asking me questions about her, for until then he had never heard of her, I saw her wave the white bonnet as she entered the village and disappeared among its houses. Very soon the 1st Maryland Infantry and Major Robert Wheat's Louisiana Battalion were rushing down the hill and into the town. General Jackson, with a semi-smile, suggested that I had better go with them and see if I could get any more information from that young lady. It took very little time to get in Front Royal and clean it out. The pursuit of the retreating Federals was kept up, with cavalry, the infantry following as quickly as possible. While this was being done, I looked for Belle Boyd, and found her standing on the pavement in front of a hotel, talking with a few Federal officers, prisoners, and some of her acquaintances of our army. Her cheeks were rosy with excitement and recent exercise, and her eyes all aflame. When I rode up to speak to her, she received me with such surprised cordiality, and as I stooped from the saddle, she pinned a crimson rose to my uniform, bidding me remember that it was a blood red, and I was her colors. I left her to join the general." So there you go. You kind of have the story from one perspective from Belle Boyd, and then you have the story from Henry Kidd Douglas, who's, in the story. So it is actually kind of interesting. And I thought, like I said, I thought it was good to read from two, corroborating tales. And it's not always that you get that, but certainly here, I figured if I have the resources available, why not? But let's go ahead and call today's episode to a close right there. We went over some firsthand accounts of secret missions, espionage in the Civil War, and there are two pretty well-known figures that we talked about in our narrative episodes, one being Alan Pinkerton and one being Belle Boyd, two, once again, one of our more well-known names when it comes to spies in the Civil War. So hopefully you found those interesting. Next time, when we are back here, we will actually go to Oklahoma. We need to actually cover a battle that we missed. And it's not often that we have an event that we had missed from the narrative. I think we were pretty thorough in that. But we need to go back and cover 2nd Cabin Creek. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website as well as Patreon information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Once again, feedback is welcome. Questions, comments, concerns, the email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.